All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. We're looking at the historic transition of the Israel-Iran rivalry, how it went from a covert shadow war to an unprecedented, direct military confrontation. For decades, these two regional powers were locked in a bitter, hidden struggle, always carefully avoiding open combat. But as we'll see, over the course of 2024 and 2025, the unwritten rules of their conflict were fundamentally shattered.
Just look at this number for a second. 550. That is the staggering number of ballistic missiles Iran fired at Israel during the intense climax of this conflict. That number represents a total departure from the past. It marks the terrifying moment when indirect maneuvering turned into a devastating direct aerial bombardment.
To make sense of how we reached this explosive boiling point, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the open war that began in 2024 and 2025. Second, the decades of shadow warfare leading up to it. Third, the nuclear flashpoint. Fourth, the security dilemma. And finally, a look at our fragile future. So let's kick things off with Section 1, the open war begins, focusing on the 2024 to 2025 escalation. The spark that really ignited this powder keg was Israel's strike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus back in April 2024. Right after that, the mirrored rhetoric from both nations' leaders basically set the stage for open war. There was absolutely no more hiding behind proxies. The hostility was public, it was direct, and it promised some severe consequences. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made their mindset incredibly clear. He stated, Iran will pay for its aggression. We've already shown our resolve by eliminating key figures in Hezbollah and Hamas. So Israel essentially framed its preemptive strikes as absolutely necessary self-defense. Their stated goal was to eliminate existential threats and fundamentally degrade the leadership of those Iranian proxy groups surrounding their borders. And directly in response to that, Iranian leadership signaled a strict zero-tolerance policy. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei warned Israel's actions will not go unanswered. We will respond with unimaginable force. And this wasn't just an empty threat. This rhetoric quickly translated into an unprecedented operational shift, which culminated in massive retaliatory missile salvos directed right at Israeli soil. Which brings us to the 12 days of war in June 2025. This period represented a total threshold breach. We literally moved far beyond proxy skirmishes into full-scale war. Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, filling the skies with over 200 fighter jets. On the flip side, Iran unleashed roughly 550 ballistic missiles and over 1,000 drones, specifically designed to saturate Israeli air defenses. The U.S. even intervened directly with Operation Midnight Hammer, using B-2 stealth bombers to strike the deeply buried Iranian facility at Fordo. The human cost was undeniably tragic, with 935 Iranians and 28 Israelis killed. All right, moving on to Section 2. Decades of shadow warfare, looking at proxies, cyber warfare, and covert ops. Now, to truly grasp the severity of what happened in 2025, we have to flash back. For years, Iran utilized a highly calculated strategy of proxy warfare by supporting and heavily arming non-state actors like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and the Houthis in Yemen. Iran effectively managed to encircle Israel. This created a really powerful localized web of deterrence. It allowed them to project Iranian influence and threat without actually triggering an open state-to-state war. But Israel definitely fought back, and they did it using entirely new domains. The 2009 Stuxnet cyber attack is a brilliant example of how these covert tactics evolved. Israeli and U.S. intelligence deployed a highly sophisticated computer virus that infiltrated Iran's Natanz facility. They secretly caused 984 specific centrifuges to speed up and crash, all while feeding false normal readings to the operator's screens so they wouldn't even know what was happening. It's wild to think about, but this cyber weapon delayed Iran's nuclear program by a year and a half without dropping a single physical bomb. And these covert operations reached some startling technological heights on the ground, too. Take the assassination of Iran's top nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. He was killed using a 1-ton robotic machine gun. It was smuggled into the country in pieces, hidden in a truck, and controlled entirely remotely via satellite with a 1.6-second AI-adjusted delay. It really shows the staggering lethal lengths both sides were willing to go to in the shadows.
Next up is Section 3, the nuclear flashpoint. We'll be touching on strikes, archives, and the JCPOA.
So the existential anxiety driving this entire shadow war stems fundamentally from one thing: the pursuit and the prevention of nuclear weapons capability. And there is a clear, decades-long history of nuclear preemption here. Back in 1981, Israel destroyed Iraq's Osirak reactor. In 2007, they took out Syria's Al-Kabar facility. So you see, Israel has this deeply ingrained doctrine of preemptively striking regional nuclear threats. Because of that, when the 2015 JCPOA diplomatic agreement eventually collapsed after the U.S. withdrawal in 2018, it essentially paved the way for Israel to return to this preemptive doctrine regarding Iran.
But what actually accelerated the collapse of that diplomatic deal? Well, it was a truly cinematic intelligence heist in 2018. Mossad agents infiltrated a warehouse in the Shorabad district of Tehran late at night. They used 2,500-degree blowtorches to literally slice open 16 highly secure safes, and they managed to exfiltrate half a ton of documents, that's about 55,000 pages, all before dawn. This daring raid provided the exact documentation that the US and Israel used to justify abandoning the JCPOA, which basically accelerated the path right to our current crisis.
That brings us to Section 4, the security dilemma, looking at all of this from a realist perspective.
So, how do international relations experts impartially analyze this spiraling conflict without taking sides? Well, according to peer-reviewed research from World Scientific Publishing, we can best understand this entire situation through the academic framework of realism. Now, remember, this isn't about framing things as good versus evil. It's about looking at how states act in an anarchic global system just to ensure their own survival. And that brings us to a core concept in international relations: the security dilemma. Think of it like this. When one state takes measures to increase its own security, it inherently threatens another state. That second state then reacts to secure itself, which in turn threatens the first state even more. It's a vicious cycle. Ultimately, both Israel's preemptive actions and Iran's reactive deterrence posture were driven by this mutual, constantly escalating need for state survival. Let's look at exactly how those theories play out in reality. Through the lens of offensive realism, Israel's preemptive strikes are viewed as a way to maximize power and proactively eliminate existential threats before they have a chance to mature. But through the lens of defensive realism, Iran's proxy network and massive missile program are a way to balance that power, deterring strikes through the threat of mutually assured escalation. When you view it objectively, these theories perfectly explain how indirect methods eventually proved insufficient, which inevitably pushed both nations toward a direct military clash.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, a fragile future, covering 2026 and beyond. The intense violence of 2024 and 2025 fundamentally shattered the old rules of engagement, leaving us to navigate a deeply uncertain and fragile new reality. Let's look at the timeline that finally halted the escalation in 2026, following a second devastating wave of strikes in late February, which resulted in the death of Iran's supreme leader Khamenei. The international community desperately scrambled for a resolution. This immense pressure led to a fragile ceasefire announced in Islamabad in April, and eventually an interim peace deal signed by the US and Iran in June. But we have to acknowledge that the fallout was incredibly severe. This didn't just stay confined to the Middle East. It crippled the global supply chains you and I rely on every single day. We saw extreme maritime aggression by Houthi rebels in the Red Sea, and Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz caused massive global energy disruptions. It also accelerated some huge strategic realignments. The U.S. deepened its support for Israel, while Iran pivoted strongly toward China. More than anything, though, it proved that traditional deterrence models are straight up failing in our modern interconnected age.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we really have to ask ourselves, was the 2026 ceasefire a lasting resolution, or was it just a brief pause? With the unresolved threat of nuclear proliferation still looming large in the background, will the security dilemma inevitably push the world over the edge into an even wider conflict? It's a lot to think about. Thank you for learning with me today, and keep questioning the complex world around you.